20. 1,720 is a bid.
30.
30. 7 ain't 30. He bids again. 40.
50.
50. He bids again.
50.
Are you up to it?
Hello,
This man means
and welcome
business.
to the First Brick
90.
Property Podcast,
1.0.
episode
Going,
6.
going,
My name is
going.
KM, I'm the director of First Brick Property Buyers Agency and the co-host of the First Brick Property Podcast. The purpose of the podcast is to bring a casual style show to discuss all things property, with education being the key. Our episodes will range from discussing a variety of topics to having special guests who can share insights into the property world. Whether you're a beginner or a seasoned investor, we believe the show will be able to further your knowledge and really remove any barriers to getting involved in the exciting and fun world of property. Today I'm joined by my better looking co-host, Hani Rojdi. How are you, my friend?
Pretty good. I might keep coming on this show just for the compliments.
Right, it's not a compliment. It's what's real. We've got a person watching us from the corner. He also agrees. He thinks you're the better looking guy. So, yep, he said yes with his hands.
I'll take that action.
Yeah. Today I thought we might talk about a very important topic. It's a topic everyone has a viewpoint on. Everyone's got an opinion. Sometimes it's a bit controversial. I guess it's the great property debate.
Absolutely.
Positive gearing versus negative gearing. You up for it?
Yeah, man. Let's do it.
Cool. We'll get stuck into it. We'll get into it straight away. I guess we'll probably start by defining what positive and negative gearing is for anyone that hasn't heard of the terms before. Henny, do you want to let them know what positive gearing is?
Yeah. Okay. So very simply, positive gearing is when you make more money from your investment property than your outgoings. So you're ultimately in a net profit position. So your rental income will cover your loan repayments, your council rates, whatever other expenses you may have. And at the end of the month and then at the end of the year, you have more money in your pocket than your outgoings. Negative gearing is the complete opposite of that. It's when you're in a net loss position. So the rent that you receive doesn't cover all the loan repayments or the council rates or the maintenance and all of those costs. So at the end of the month and then at the end of the year, you're out of pocket a certain amount of dollars and therefore you're in a net loss position, and that's what negative gearing is. Yeah,
beautiful. Just on that point, just to note, sometimes people, when they calculate if it's positive or negative gearing, they only look at loan repayments. They don't actually take into account interest and maintenance and other fees that you've mentioned.
Yeah.
So it just depends on how you want to calculate it. Obviously, the more accurate way is to take into account all the costs that you've mentioned. Alright, so we've defined what positive and negative gearing is. Let's discuss, I guess, the advantages and disadvantages of both.
Yeah.
I'll start with the advantages of negative gearing. So probably number one advantage that everyone, I guess, is familiar with, and the main reason that people choose negative geared properties is tax deductions. So common reason investors choose it is it allows you to claim tax deductions related to the expenses you incur. So you can reduce your rental shortfall and ultimately reduce your taxable income through negative gearing. So tax deductions is the main advantage. The next main advantage, I guess, is capital growth. So assuming the strategy goes to plan for people that look at negative gearing, the capital returns from the property will eventually outweigh the borrowing levels and costs to create wealth for investors at sale. More affordable for tenants is, I guess, an advantage of negative gearing in the sense that it can be easier for a tenant. It can be easier to secure a tenant for the long term, as the rents are obviously a bit lower. The caveat is that if the purchase price is really, really high, you might still have high rent, but as the percentage is lower, it's still negative geared. So it still might be unaffordable or not as easy to secure tenants. And probably the next point, the last point for the advantage of negative gearing is it's less volatile. So unlike a property in a regional area, which may rely heavily on particular employment industries to drive up demand, these properties rely on a variety of factors and can be less volatile investment.
I would just make a point on the first point that you made about the tax deductions. So basically, usually what happens is people have a loss throughout the year and then they lodge their tax return and they get a bit of a refund because they're in that loss position. What a lot of people don't know who are in this position is you can vary the tax that gets withheld from your pay throughout the year. So instead of getting a big refund at the end of the year when you lodge your tax return, you can just pay less tax during the year. It is very important to speak to your accountant if you do plan on doing something like that, but the option is there, and you've just got to lodge a form with the ATO where they withhold less tax during the year. It means you have to forecast the loss that you expect at year end, but it is an option for people that do negative gear throughout the year.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's the taxman talking.
Yeah.
Do you want to go through the disadvantages?
Yeah. So budgeting may be needed because obviously you're in a loss position. So you may need to budget for the ongoing shortfalls. Also, when the property is sold for profit, the taxman does collect some tax on the capital gain because it is an investment property. The next point is it's a long-term strategy. It's a longer-term wealth creation strategy. So if your circumstances change and a sale is necessary, it may not work out favorably for you. And probably the last disadvantage for negative gearing is that it is a high financial risk. If in the instance you were to lose your job, would you be able to maintain the costs that are involved, especially because you're in a loss position? So make sure you have a plan in place and ensure that you're prepared, for example, income protection and insurance policies.
Yeah, great. I'll add to that as well. The financial risk is maybe not financial risk, but it can impact your future borrowing. So when banks look at giving you a loan, they're not just looking at how much equity or how much borrowing power, or they are, but when they're assessing it, they're also looking at, can you service the loan? And if you're in a negative geared state, which means you're losing money on a particular property, they're going to look at that and say, you're losing this much on this property, you're going to be losing this much on the next property. Will you be able to pay off both? Yeah. And it can inhibit your borrowing power for future acquisitions. It can slow down your property acquisitions in that sense. So we'll talk about positive gearing. The advantages of positive gearing, I guess the biggest one there is the increased income. So you benefit by receiving an income from the property and not having to be out of pocket. So you can even use this to make additional payments into your mortgage and own your own home sooner. Or just as we're touching on the last negative for disadvantages, for the last disadvantage for negative gearing, it can also help you with your borrowing power and your serviceability for your next property. Less risk. So if your income circumstances change, so if you were to lose your job, then the income will cover the cost of the investment. You're less likely to need to sell under pressure and potentially unfavorable conditions. It allows for a balanced portfolio. So some investors may use a positively geared property to balance their portfolio, using the additional income to pay for shortfalls of other negatively geared properties. And lender attractiveness. So what I already spoke about, the additional income can increase your attractiveness to lenders for additional loans. The disadvantages, Henny, do you want to go through it?
Yep. So the first disadvantage, and I think people really should change their mindset and not classify this as a disadvantage, but the first one is that it's taxable. Just like any form of income, the income you earn from a positively geared property is taxable, but keep in mind it means that you're making a profit and that's why you're paying tax. The second one is slower long-term growth. Often, but not always, a positive cash flow investment can be located in a regional area rather than capital cities, which commonly but not always sees less or slower capital growth. And the third point is that it may be more volatile. These properties may be largely dependent on particular industry of employment, which can make it subject to greater volatility should employment factors weaken.
Yeah, so I think you can see there the disadvantages and advantages kind of are just flipped for both positive and negative gear. So we've discussed both of them, and I think, like you mentioned, with the disadvantage of positive gear, the tax, it might be a myth, and I think it might be a good idea that let's talk about some myths, I guess, associated to both of these states, and let's see if we can expel some. So positive gearing, I mean, a lot of people think you can't get positive geared properties anymore, and the simple answer is you can. You just have to look. Might not be able to find them in Sydney anymore, but regional areas or other areas such as Brisbane right now, rents are very, very good in Brisbane.
Yeah.
Property prices aren't too high, so more often than not, you're positively geared, if not at least negatively, at least neutrally geared.
Yeah.
So you can definitely get positively geared properties, but you just have to look out for them.
Look, and that is really important to consider the different markets and the changes in the markets. Because I remember at one point, if you were buying a property in Sydney, the very basic calculation was if you spend $500,000, you should expect to get $500 a week in rent.
Yeah.
Now, those days are long gone now.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean you can't get that sort of return somewhere else or even better. And that's why it's really important to consider the changing market and just expand your scope. Just because you live in Sydney doesn't mean you have to get a property in Sydney.
Correct. So we've spoken about that on previous episodes a bit as well, about being borderless investors, and it's very important, especially because everyone's financial situation is different, and 500,000 in Sydney might not get you much. 500,000 outside Sydney can get you a lot.
Yep.
So just depends in your position, your financial position, your goals, and your time frame, I guess. So good point there. I think the other myth with positively geared properties is you can't get a positively geared property that's going to give you capital growth as well. This is just a massive myth, completely incorrect. You can, and just like we mentioned before, you just have to look. So different markets have different data points and have different, reasons why they work and don't work. Again, Sydney itself is not going to get you the highest rent, but it will give you capital growth. And another market might give you really good capital, really good rent and not much capital growth. There are definitely markets where you can achieve both for sure. So that's just a myth I guess it's a myth.
Yeah.
It's completely incorrect. Do you have any more? Yeah.
No, same thing goes for negative gearing. It's got its own myths associated with it as well. The first one is that negative gearing is a good long-term strategy. And the short answer is no, for two reasons. The first is you're losing money. Yes, you're saving tax, but at the end of the day, you're still losing money. So just because think about it as, you lose $1 on your investment so you can get 50 cents back in tax, you're still short. You're still losing money. And over the long term, by nature, as you pay a property down, rent increases, your repayments eventually get to a point where your rent is more than your repayments. It eventually does become positive.
Yeah, so just moving, staying with what you're saying there, I guess the biggest myth is that it saves me money.
Yep.
Which you pretty much said really well with that little example of, losing $1 to get 50 cents back. We'll speak about this point with an example to really hone that you're not actually saving money in the long term. We might just jump into that example. So this is a very basic, bare bones example. There's a lot of factors that we've taken out of it just for the simplicity, just to really, emphasize the point here. So let's say someone's, taxable income is $100,000 a year, and they purchase a home, and the repayments, when you look at the repayments and you look at the amount of rent they're bringing in, after the rent and the repayments are looked after, you're up $3,000 or $3,200 a year, for example. That means we add the $3,200 to your taxable income because it is income, so you got to pay tax on it, which means you're about $103,000 of income for that year. After you pay tax of about $25,000, you're taking home $77,500 a year. If we look at the flip side, if you're losing money and your rent isn't covering your repayments, if we look at a similar scenario, again, $100,000 a year income, and you're losing $2,000 a year from the property, that means your taxable income is only going to be $98,000. That's because you've theoretically saved $2,000 in tax from your losses. So you'd pay a little bit less in tax, just under $24,000, but your take home is also under $75,000. So in that situation, the person that's paying more tax is making $78,000, and the person paying less tax is making $74,000. So you can see here that, I guess, despite one scenario, you're saving $2,000 in tax, you're also taking home less money. Again, this example is very simplified and there are a lot more factors to it, but it's just to illustrate and maybe dispel a belief that positive geared properties aren't great, or perhaps the belief that you save more money from a negative geared property. At the end, one is making you lose money and one is making you more money despite paying more tax. I mean, if you pay more tax, you're usually making more money. Is that correct, Taxman?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So, I mean, I like to ask people really simply to really simplify this. Would you rather make 70 grand a year and pay less tax, or make 100 grand a year and pay more tax? What would you choose?
Yeah. I mean, think about it. Would you run a business at a continuous loss?
You wouldn't.
Very unlikely.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to. And that's a good point. I mean, property investing is a business, right? It's not a hobby. You are running your own business, investing in property, and you don't want to be losing money from your business. You know, if you're running a restaurant, you're not operating to lose money. Yep. Same thing with property. So,
and look, there's definitely always going to be tax factors that you need to take into consideration, but it shouldn't be the sole purpose for investing in property. You're also looking at additional income, you're looking at wealth creation, you're looking at creating equity. It shouldn't just be, I'm just going to make this tax loss for the rest of my life and I'm just going to keep, claiming tax refunds every year and I've got an investment property. Obviously there are tax considerations that you should take into account, but losing money shouldn't be the sole focus of your investment, which is effectively what you're doing.
Correct.
If negative gearing is your only strategy.
Correct. So I think with negative gearing, something that we like to say is negative gearing is a moment in time, and it can be beneficial in certain situations, but it is definitely not a long-term strategy. Yeah. So if your long-term strategy is to purchase a bunch of negatively geared properties and save tax, that is not a good strategy.
Not for the long term.
Not for the long term.
Yeah.
Correct. As always, this is general advice. You should always discuss with your accountant and financial advisor. If you're interested on how we made some of those calculations, when we were doing that example, the Property Calculator Australia app, I mention it most episodes because it's a fantastic app. Everyone that we speak to, all the guests use it. Real quick, if you're not using it and you want to make sure your numbers are all good, download the app, Apple Store, Android, it's everywhere, free to use, really simple, and you can just work out your payments really quickly and know what your rent's going to be and work out if you're going to be positive or negative. Also, the ATO Tax calculator online can help you work out how much tax you're paying real quick. I'm not a genius. I use the calculator online to figure that out.
Yeah.
I think that wraps it up for, I guess, a brief introduction into positive and negative gearing. Did you have anything else you wanted to add to that?
No, I think that's it. There is definitely a lot more to it, but I guess if people have questions, they can send them through and we can definitely do a more detailed episode on this because there is a lot more that we can talk about. Yeah,
for sure. So I guess the purpose of this episode was just to introduce positive and negative gearing to people who perhaps haven't heard of it or just know the basics. We'll definitely do a deeper dive in another episode. So there you have it all. That's the 6th episode of the First Brick Property Podcast. It's come to an end. That was fun. I enjoyed it. And I hope you guys learned the difference between positive and negative geared properties, the benefits of both, and hopefully it can help you make a more informed decision next time you're looking at properties. You can find all our content on social media pages, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and just search First Brick Property and we'll come up there. If you have any topics you'd like to discuss on the podcast, or have any questions around this episode or any other questions, we're looking at doing a Q&A episode soon. So please send us a message on our socials or email us at hello@firstbrick.com.au. Also, if you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe so you don't miss an episode on whatever platform you're listening to us on. And if you want to give us a rating, preferably a 5-star, please do. If you want to leave a comment about my co-host, please do.
Only good comments.
Only good comments. And Pass the Pod movement continues. If you know one person that you think this podcast would benefit, let them know. Pass the pod on. Hashtag it. Hashtag Pass the Pod. Thanks, Sani. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
No worries. Buying property is our passion. Helping you do it is our mission. Thanks.